Hello everyone, welcome to our presentation on one of the normative ethical theories, which is utilitarianism. In this presentation, we are going to discuss the concept of utilitarianism, Jeremy Bentham's model of utilitarianism, John Stuart Mill's model of utilitarianism, the act and rule utilitarianism, and might as well the problems with utilitarianism. But before we proceed, let us first have a brief discussion on what is utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is an ethical theory founded by Jeremy Bentham and developed and popularized by John Stuart Mill. As the term suggests, utilitarianism is founded on the principle of utility, which adheres to the belief that an act is good or morally right if it promotes happiness, and bad or immoral if it tends to produce pain. The key, therefore, in utilitarianism is the principle of happiness. Hence again, in utilitarianism, an act is good or morally right if it produces greatest happiness to the greatest number of people, and bad or immoral if it produces more harm or pain than benefits or happiness to the greatest number of people. This explains why the utilitarian would not care whether the action is done out of deception, lie, or manipulation, as long as it produces maximum benefits to many people. For example, the act of condemning a terrorist to death is morally right, that is, good for the utilitarian, because this action produces equal benefits or greatest happiness to the greatest number of people concerned. Let us take the famous case of Robin Hood as another example. As is well known, Robin Hood steals properties from wealthy people and gives them to the poor. From the vantage point of Christian ethics, Robin Hood's act is immoral because it deprived the wealthy people of the right that is due to them. However, from the vantage point of utilitarianism, Robin Hood's act is morally good because it produces maximum benefits, that is, greatest happiness, to the majority of the people.
Now let us discuss Jeremy Bentham's model of utilitarianism, and let's start by asking the question, how does Bentham view happiness? Well, for Bentham, happiness is simply the absence of pain, and so, Bentham introduced the philosophic calculus to measure the degree of happiness or pleasure that a specific action may produce. The philosophic calculus is also called the utility calculus or hedonistic calculus. It includes intensity, duration, certainty, propinquity, fecundity, purity, and extent. And so, for Bentham, the intense the pleasure, the better. The longer it lasts, the better. The more certain that it will happen, the better. The closer that it will occur, the better. The greater the possibility that it will be followed by another pleasure, the better. The purer the pleasure, the better. And the greater the number of people that it benefits, the better. The formula of Bentham's philosophic calculus goes like this. Happiness minus pain is equal to balance. For Bentham, the balance is the basis of the morality of an action. In other words, for Bentham, if the balance is in favor of happiness, then the act is morally right. And if it is in favor of pain, then it is morally wrong. Now, how do we do this? Well, Bentham said that we just need to sum up all the pleasures and pains produced by the action. If the balance is in favor of pleasure, then the act is morally right. But if the balance is in favor of pain, then the action is morally wrong. Now let us put it in a simple mathematical calculation. And so if an act produces 12 pleasures and 6 pains, then the balance is 6, which is in favor of pleasure or happiness. Hence, if this is the case, then for Bentham the action is morally right. However, if the act produces 20 pains and just 5 pleasures, then the balance is 15, which is in favor of pain. If this is the case, then for Bentham the act is morally wrong.
John Stuart Mill's model of utilitarianism. Now let us proceed to John Stuart Mill's model of utilitarianism. It is important to note that Mill disagrees with Bentham. Mill argues that we cannot calculate the amount of pleasure or pain that an act produces. Thus, for Mill, the philosophic calculus cannot be the basis of morality, but the majority of the people that attain happiness. Thus, the famous utilitarian claim, an act is morally right if it produces greatest happiness to the greatest number of people, and it is morally wrong if it produces more pain than pleasure to the greatest number of people concerned. As we can see, Mill's utilitarianism is considered qualitative since the philosopher emphasized intellectual pleasure than sensual pleasure. Thus, his famous saying goes, "It is better to be Socrates, dissatisfied, than a pig satisfied."
We also have what we call the act utilitarianism, which holds that the utilitarian principle should be applied to a particular act in a particular situation or circumstance. It takes into account the possible result of each act. Hence, as the name suggests, in act utilitarianism, the basis of the morality of an action is the action itself. Hence, in act utilitarianism, we should perform those actions that produce greatest happiness to the greatest number of people concerned. Now, there's also what we call as rule utilitarianism, on the other hand, holds that the principle at issue should be used to test moral rules, and then such rules can be utilized in judging what is right and wrong under the circumstance. Here, we consider the possible results in the light of the rules. Thus, in rule utilitarianism, an act is morally right if it conforms to justified moral rule. And of course, we know that moral rules are justified if such rules produce greatest happiness to the greatest number of people concerned. Let us take again as an example of the act of condemning a terrorist to death. And so, an act utilitarian would ask the question, what possible good or evil results from this act? Then, if the majority of the people are benefited by the act itself, then it is moral. A rule utilitarian, on the other hand, would ask whether there is a rule or law that condemns terrorists to death, and whether this rule was formulated based on the utility principle. If this is the case, then it may be morally right to sentence a terrorist to death.
The problems with utilitarianism. Like all normative theories of ethics, utilitarianism cannot address all of the ethical dilemmas we face. Sometimes using utilitarian principle may be harmful to a group of people or to an individual. While utilitarianism is currently a very popular ethical theory, there are some difficulties in relying on it as a sole method for moral decision making. First, that utilitarian calculation requires that we assign values to the benefits and harms resulting from our action and compare them with the benefits and harms that might result from other action. But it's often difficult, if not impossible, to measure and compare the values of certain benefits and costs. How do we how do we go about assigning a value to life or to art? And how do we go about comparing the value of money with, for example, the value of life, the value of time, or the value of human dignity? Moreover, can we really be attained about all the consequences of our actions? Our ability to measure and predict the benefit and harms resulting from course of action or a moral rule dubious, to say at least. Perhaps the greatest difficulty with utilitarianism is that it fails to take into account considering of justice. We can imagine instances where a certain course of action will produce a great benefits for society, but they will be clearly unjust. If moral decisions are to take into account considerations of justice, then apparently utilitarian cannot be a sole principle guiding our decisions. It can, however, play a role in these decisions. The principle of utilitarianism invites us to consider the immediate and less immediate consequences of our actions. Given its insistence on summing the benefits and harms of all people, utilitarian asks us to look beyond self-interest and consider impartially the interests of all persons affected by our actions. As John Stuart Mill once wrote, the happiness which forms the utilitarian standard of what is right in conduct is not own happiness, but that's all concern. As between his own happiness, that of others, utilitarianism requires him to be strictly impartial and disinterested and benevolent spectator. In an era today that some of have characterized as the age of self-interest, utilitarianism is a powerful reminder that morality calls us to look beyond the self to look beyond the self to the good of all.
So here are our key takeaways based from our discussion on utilitarianism. Firstly, utilitarianism is a theory of morality which advocates actions that foster happiness and opposes actions that cause unhappiness. Secondly, utilitarianism promotes the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people. Thirdly, when used in a socio-political construct, utilitarian ethics aims for the betterment of society as a whole. And lastly, utilitarianism is a reason-based approach to determining right and wrong, but it has limitations. That concludes our discussion on one of the normative ethical theories, utilitarianism. Thank you for listening.